Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today we begin our discussion on how Rogal Dorn felt about each and every one of his Primarch brothers. Obviously a general spoiler warning here to begin, as I will be referencing events from across the Warhammer 40k universe, and in particular the Horus Heresy series. So you have been warned. Now, as always with these Primarch opinion conversations, we stick to the lore we can see within the novels themselves, as opposed to any more vague references that are out there. And also, I do my best to track back through and re-find moments and references that we've seen, but I'm only one guy and only human, so of course there may be things I forgot, missed, or simply never seen, but I do my best. And as always, sometimes we've simply never seen anything, so we have to make an educated guess with what we know. However, with that all out the way, let's begin as usual in Legion order, with the first, Lionel Johnson. Now, thankfully here, we actually have a few references in how Rogal feels about L. Johnson. A bit of a rarity when it comes to the enigmatic Lord of the First. And it was within Rogal's Primarch series novel, we saw the Praetorian upon a shared campaign within the Great Crusade, alongside Lionel Johnson, Fulgrim, and Horus Lupercal. Actually the conquest of the future Eye of Terror region, known at the time as the Occluda Noctis. And this was quite early on, when Rogal had only been leading his legion for around 10 years, and Lionel Johnson himself was newly fresh into the Crusade, the latest Primarch brother found and reunited with the Imperium. The interactions between them were formal, always following decorum. However, there was a clear tension that developed due to their differing opinions of how the campaign should be fought, and it led to some pretty tense interactions between them. The Lion hesitated, thinking the question a trick, but unable to see it. I fought in many sieges, on both sides of the wall. Even more enemy strongholds have fallen to me since the Emperor lifted me from Caliban. And in all of those campaigns, when you had the castle surrounded, the environs secured or pillaged, that's when you counted victory, am I right? Of course not. The Lion's mane of hair fell about his shoulders as he shook his head. A fortress is only undone once the attacker is inside, and never a second earlier. Then we are in agreement. Dorn sat back, arms crossed. The Lion glanced at Horus, who looked on impassively, and received only a raised eyebrow in support from Fulgrim. "Make plain your accusation, Rogal," the Lion demanded, standing with fists on the table. As he did so, the Primarch looked across the map again, and Gidorius could almost see the light of understanding coming to his eyes. He jabbed a finger towards the blank centre of the map. "You think this a castle?" "I think the analogy works," Dorn replied evenly. "I would not like to engage in pedantry about it." The Lion rubbed his bearded chin as he regarded his brother, and then turned his attention back to the map. "One does not charge headlong at the gates, Rogal," he said, lifting his gaze from the star chart. "One scouts, counts the defenders, and reckons the defences before formulating a plan. What if one could attack swiftly enough that the defenders have no warning, and you have a chance of finding the fortress with its gates open and unbarred? One can ride around and around the walls out of arrow range all day, and not make a single pace of progress towards victory. No matter how well scouted, the wall still remains, and someone must break it or scale it. It requires courage and fortitude to meet the problem swiftly and decisively. "This is courage," growled the lion, his finger jabbing the wedge of systems taken by the 7th, stumbling from one enemy to the next, and hitting whatever comes in front of you. "Perhaps we should rise for," began Fulgrim, throwing a look towards Horus. Lupercal shook his head, his attention moving from the lion to Dorn and back again. "No, ill words are like meat on the fire. It does no good to leave them untended, for they will grow more heated and tougher to swallow, or else turn to ashes altogether." And it only gets worse. Rogal's stubborn attitude continuing and El'Jonson's temper boiling, ultimately leading to a duel of champions, which the Dark Angels would win, forcing Rogal to apologise to his brother. And so it's a clear early sign of there being a clash of attitudes between them. Perhaps the stubborn streak within each of them rubbing against each other. Although, as I remember saying a long time ago, when I first read Rogal's Primarch novel, I do have to say El'Jonson does feel a little out of character in this one. Far more temperamental and emotional with his brothers than the aloof, ice-cold predator he's supposed to be. However, we could write that up to being a sighting of the early lion, eager to stake his place amongst his kin. But we can also see clear signs of a respectful, yet also strained relationship later in the Heresy era still, when Rogal makes several comments regarding the lion's absence from Terra, at times being accepting of the decision to prosecute the traitor homeworlds, such as when Sanguinius first arrived at Terra, and at others sounding critical of it. The lion incommunicado as always. The added "as always" is pretty telling of Dorn's opinion. A disapproving opinion. And for me again, it boils down to the fact El'Jonson doesn't act the way Rogal would. How Rogal wants him to. And for Rogal, it's not just that he wants people to act how he expects. It's that he believes they should. There's a line in his Primarch novel that sums it up brilliantly, of how he believes all his other brothers interpret the Emperor's orders, whereas he performs exactly what's asked. In reality, I think we could rightly argue that in some cases, but of course Primarch novels are always showpieces for that particular Primarch. And at the end of the day, I think that reinforces the notion of why he struggles with El'Jonson. Because the lion doesn't act how Rogal thinks he should. He respects him, but is very frustrated by him. Something that's going to be a very reoccurring theme here. However, moving on to Fulgrim. Now, as seen in that shared campaign with El'Jonson, Lupercal and Fulgrim, Rogal and the Phoenician actually got along quite well. Yes, they had very different personalities, but there was a clear respect between them. As the argument between El'Jonson and Rogal goes on, it's Fulgrim who attempts to be mediator. And there's times where he winces at Rogal's comments. His bluntness, knowing it's only going to cause more problems. And so you can see Fulgrim understands how his brother thinks, and recognises his flaws, that lack of personal tact in some manners. However, Fulgrim accepts him for it, and even in those tense moments, Dorn's affection for his brother is evident too. The air was tense for several seconds, before Fulgrim's laugh broke the stillness like shattering crystal. His following words light, but sincere. "Then I can only wish you fair fortune on your endeavours. I do not know when we shall meet again, but I hope it is not too long, brother. It is important that, although we may differ in many ways, We are one beneath the master of mankind. I look forward to standing beside you on a battlefield one day." Dorn smiled, a rare event for Gidarius to witness. "That would be good, my brother." Fulgrim gave a brief, courtly bow, which Dorn answered with a sharp nod. Such was the Phoenician's fall from grace. I think he, of all the Primarchs, suffers from being overshadowed by the depraved demon he would become. However, the Primarch he truly was a good man, and he did indeed have genuine friends amongst his kin, with Rogal being one. And even later, after Rogal's encounter with him during the Saturnine Gambit in the Siege of Terra, Rogal's opinion and praise for his former brother is evident. You know the real irony? Fulgrim could have taken the wall. The power he has, the Legion strength, the unimaginable demon gifts. He cut the wall wide open, brother. Wide open. But for a stroke of fortune, I held it closed. Fulgrim got deeper and faster than any of them so far. Excess was his undoing, as ever, the brazen confidence of overstrength. He threw his whole damn legion into a space too small. Dorn shook his head. He smiled at the angel sadly. "I tell you this plainly, brother," he said. "If the War Master or the Lord of Iron had ever managed to harness him, he would have won this for them in a matter of days. He could have been their greatest weapon." And this is not simply Rogal referring to the monster Fulgrim had become. This is Rogal referring to the genius, the perfection his brother once possessed. So maybe a surprise to some, but the Praetorian and the Phoenician shared a good brotherhood. One I'd actually enjoy seeing more of sometime, to be honest. However, moving on. Next we have Perturabo. Now, do I even need to discuss this one? There was quite obviously a huge distaste between these two. Rogal viewing Perturabo as having an extremely arrogant opinion of himself. For example, within The Lost and the Damned, we get the Dorn comment of, "Horus would not. Perturabo's arrogance can be relied upon, if nothing else can be," he said. Only when he spoke of the hated Lord of Iron did his delivery take on a hint of emotion. But for me, the best example comes from Dorn's own thoughts within the short story The Lightning Tower. Dorn smiled despite his mood. His years of exchanged insults with Perturabo seemed almost comical compared to this. They were too much alike, too jealous of one another's oh-so-similar abilities. Dorn knew it was a weakness for him to have risen to the Iron Warrior's baiting, but competition had always been a motivating force amongst the Primarch brothers. It had been encouraged as a factor to drive them on to greater and yet greater accomplishments. So pretty straightforward here in Rogal's own mind. Too similar, too competitive. Maybe one of the biggest tragedies of the Primarchs being scattered across the galaxy. Because surely these two Primarchs, so similar in so many ways, could have and should have been the best of friends. Instead, they were rivals, jealous, despising each other. A feud that clearly was allowed to aid the Primarch's efforts in the Great Crusade. Undoubtedly one of the many mistakes made by the Master of Mankind. The joy Perturabo felt at ripping apart and tearing down Rogal's defences on Terra speaks for itself. It was a bitter, bitter rivalry. But next up, we have Jaghatai Khan. The reserved Rogal, being so different in nature to the tribal Kargan, found him incredibly frustrating. Their arguments within the Siege of Terror are pretty legendary, with Rogal losing his you-know-what every time Jaghatai came back from one of his raids across the front lines. But in truth, it wasn't just that Jaghatai risked ruining Rogal's plans. There was also concern from Rogal there too, that Jaghatai might actually just go and get himself killed. And so that does speak to a brotherly love within the Praetorians' harsh exterior. And Rogal was also revealed to have a huge amount of respect for the Khan's ability upon the battlefield, as seen within the novel's Saturnine. It's where I wanted to put him. The Khan at Colossi, the Angel at Gorgon, that it will feel to him that I'm acquiescing to his desire for aggressive tactics. Faces are saved, and honour is retained. So you handled him. I did, and I don't like that, Dorn sighed. He's the Khan for throne's sake, the great warhawk. His doctrine of combat is superlative. As a warlord, I'd rank only Rebute above him. That's a huge compliment for Jaghatai here. We know how much Rogal values Rebute. And the term warlord is quite specific. For me, probably focusing more on the battlefield itself than a wider campaign or other aspects. But it's a profound statement, and one that truly shows a great deal of love and admiration for his infuriating brother. Again summed up by Rogal maybe the best, with a single line in the novel Warhawk. He found himself cracking a weary smile. Jaghatai, you insufferable, infuriating prodigy. I know things are going into the period of mourning post-heresy, and Rogal of all will take it the hardest. But I really hope we get a scene of Rogal visiting Jaghatai's bedside whilst he recovers. Or at least a reunion between these two who went through so much together during the siege. Especially with Sanguinius gone. Yes, Vulcan was there, but let's be honest, he was very separate. And I really think Jaghatai and Dorn deserve a moment of reunion. Just a moment. Next we have the Wolf King, Leman Russ. Oh boy, you want to talk about differences and frustration? Rogal meet Leman Russ. This one is extremely similar to what we just discussed with Jaghatai. However, this one wasn't luxury to the shared events of the siege, as Russ left the throne world to fulfill his duty as executioner. Something that infuriated Rogal to the point of boiling, yelling at Leman as he stalked away. It's obvious Rogal respected Leman for his prowess as a warrior, but it can't be denied he struggled with Russ, as evidenced in their briefing for Beta Garman upon Sanguinius' return within the novel Wolfsbane. Surely you would wish to have your vengeance upon them. I would, said Russ. They would never pay Weirgild, would they? He smiled. So they must die. I know you too well to take that as an agreement, said Dorn. It is not, admitted Russ. Do you know what I think? You are going to tell me, said Dorn wearily. Russ leaned forwards and gripped his knees. The Khan watched their exchange with interest. It will not work. This is the best course of action. Divide, hold, reinforce, pin him between our armies here and Guilliman's 13th, insisted Dorn. If we are talking about defence, then maybe it is, said Russ. And in defending, we will come close to victory, and we will fail at the last. Dorn gripped his stylus tightly. And there's a key line. where Russ asks Rogal if he thinks he's a fool, and Rogal replies, "I think you're reckless." And that is the definitive piece for me. That difference between them that grates the both of them. Rogal is a planner, solid, defensive, and Russ is the wolf, always on the offensive. Rogal doesn't think Russ is a fool. He knows better, but he does think he's reckless. That he doesn't plan the way that Rogal himself would. That he doesn't act the way Rogal would want him to. And as we're seeing often with Rogal, it's that difference that just bugs him. For what it's worth, Russ does admit to Malcador that he likes Rogal. He just finds him pretty boring. However, moving on, we have the Night Haunter, Konrad Curze. Now, this was not a good relationship at all. Firstly, Rogal greatly disapproved of Konrad's methods of war, as unfortunately for Konrad, so many of his brothers did. The best example, the campaign he, Dorn and Fulgrim led together during the late Great Crusade, where Rogal confronted Konrad for his conduct, within the short story The Dark King. Curze turned and walked back towards Dorn, with his arms stretched out to either side of him, presenting his back to the prisoner. No sooner had he turned away from the armed man than the gun had been raised, and the hard crack of a bolter shot split the air. Sparks flew as the explosive shell ricocheted from Curze's armour, and he spun on his heel to smash the prisoner's skull to splinters. The headless corpse swayed for a moment, before dropping slowly to its knees and pitching onto its chest. "You see," said Curze, his fingers dripping blood and bone fragments. "And what was that supposed to prove?" asked Dorn, his features curled in distaste. "That any chance mortals get, they will choose the path of descent. When he thought he would be punished, he dared not shoot, but the moment he believed himself free from consequence, he acted." "That was an unworthy deed," said Dorn, and Curze had turned away from him before he could elaborate. But the Imperial Fists Primarch caught his arm. "Your warriors will stand down and withdraw, Curze. That is an order, not a request. Leave this planet, now." Dorn's eyes were as hard as granite, and Curze knew enough of his brother's resolve to realise he had pushed him far enough. "When this campaign is won, you and I will have words, Curze. You have crossed the line, and I will no longer countenance your barbarous methods of war. Your way is not the way of the Imperium." Now, it must be said earlier in this confrontation, Rogal asked Konrad what's got into him, implying that even for Curze his behaviour is a little out of character. And so it is worth remembering Curze's mind greatly degenerated as the Great Crusade went on. His visions of the heresy, and it didn't help that his legion was being filled with nothing but murderers and the scum of Nostramo. So obviously that could mean, while they were never on particularly good terms, there is the possibility that it wasn't quite this bad in the years gone by, when Konrad was a bit more stable. But then after this, when Curze confided in Fulgrim about his tormenting visions of the heresy, of his own death at the hands of his father, Fulgrim of course told Rogal, whereupon Rogal, unfortunately, not being the best suited to compassion and understanding, once again confronted Konrad, furious about Konrad's claims of visions and heresy. Whereupon Konrad would attack Rogal and beat him viciously to the point of death. An event that left its mental scars upon Rogal, as well as the physical, as can be seen in his private conversation with Malcador within the short story The Lightning Tower. You confronted Curze, and he attacked me. He would have killed me, I think. He is insane. That's why we drove him out, sick of his bloodletting. That's why he burned his homeworld and took his Night Lords off into the darkest parts of the stars. Malcador nodded and continued to deal the cards. Rogal. He is what you are truly afraid of, because he is fear incarnate. No other Primarch uses terror as a weapon like Curze does. You are not afraid of Horus and his sallow heretics. You are afraid of the fear that sides with him, the night terror that advances alongside the traitors. Dorn sat back and breathed out. He has haunted me, I confess. All this time, he has haunted me. Because he was right. His visions were true. He saw this heresy coming in his visions. That is the truth you fear. You wish you had listened. So it's undoubtedly one of Rogal's most complicated relationships. One that, while never the best, degenerated through the crusade to the point of bitter distaste. Dare I say hatred. A feeling that Rogal possibly let blind him to compassion when he needed to show it. And a decision that would leave him only with regret. Moving on, we have the angel Sanguinius. Rogal was quite clearly one of the Primarchs who loved the angel. Upon mention of the loyal Primarchs across the galaxy, who could possibly yet be revealed to be traitor, Rogal point-blank refused the notion when it came to Sanguinius. And though Rogal could never really express his admiration and personal affection for the angel, simply not being naturally good at that kind of thing, that hug as the two finally enter the throne room within the end and the death speaks volumes. Dorn turns, but Sanguinius catches his arm and stops him. For a second, they stand shoulder to shoulder, eye to eye. You've performed the most extraordinary feat, Sanguinius says unexpectedly. Please remember that. Dorn is taken aback by the frankness of the comment, and the innocent sincerity with which it is expressed. His startled half-smile wavers with imprisoned emotion. A flash of light at the high-slit window of an otherwise impregnable keep. A mere fraction of your deeds, brother, he replies awkwardly. You closed the gate. You locked. Sanguinius shakes his head. I was a warrior, Rogal. Just a warrior. You were the one who mattered. He embraces the Praetorian, the spontaneous impulse of a child. As with his guileless comment, the embrace is unexpected and unself-conscious. A rare display of emotion, especially in such a gathering. For a moment, Dorn freezes, then he completes the embrace. When they step back, a single teardrop glints on the brightest one's pauldron, where the Praetorian rested his head. Ah, such a great moment. Such a great moment. As ever with the Primarchs, of course there was moments that could irate, as we see Sanguinius's private fault at one point during the siege, when Rogal has spoken to him pretty bluntly. But that's human, and there was a huge respect between the Angel and the Praetorian, and a strong brotherhood. But now, lastly, for part 1, we have Ferrus Manus. Now the two of these brothers share a lot of characteristics in common. Blunt, to the point, exemplars of loyalty, at times oblivious to the feelings of their brother Primarchs. You'd expect the two of them to get on, and perhaps they did. However, there isn't much we have regarding the two. What we do know is that at some point in the Crusade, they may well have had a fight, with a flashback in Ferrus's mind within his Primarch novel. Rogal Dorn stood over him, the rugged yellow of his gauntlet knuckles speckled with silver red. He glowered down on his brother, his countenance never wavering from one of stern reproach. The warriors of both legions looked on from the many tiers of the Fist of Iron's command deck, with expressions of horror and, though they tried to hide it, fascination. Ferrus had not intended to lose his temper, but part of him exulted that Dorn had pushed him that far, and that his brother had responded in kind. He spat blood on the baffled flooring of his bridge, and clenched his fist. We don't know much about this moment, other than Ferrus has lost his rag about something, and Rogal has punched him for whatever he's said. And Ferrus's clenched fist signifies he was about to get back up and smack Rogal back. Considering this wasn't a major moment in the lore we all know, you would assume something transpired to prevent the two from going at it completely. Arguments aren't uncommon between the Primarchs, so it doesn't necessarily imply a bad relationship. And we know that Dorn does lament the loss of Ferrus after Istvan. Plus, he retrieves the skull of his fallen brother from the vengeful spirits in the aftermath of the Emperor facing Horus. And Rogal even flinches at the mention of Ferrus's skull being there. So that implies there was a definite loss there for him. Other than that, we don't really have much to go by. But I would say it was respectful, but a not particularly close relationship. One that, as ever with Rogal, appears to have had its difficulties too. However, that's it for part 1. The rest of the Primarchs to come in part 2. What do you think of the Primarchs we've discussed today? Are there any surprises in Rogal's opinions? What do you think of Rogal's relationships with these fellow Primarchs? As always everyone, leave your thoughts in the comments below. A huge thank you to all my subscribers for your support. It truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too. But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.